How did the church go from just a small group of 11 disciples to within just a couple hundred years, the dominant religious group in the ancient Mediterranean world? Welcome to Theology Sabbath School, a ministry of the School of Theology on the campus of Walla Walla University. I'm Carl Cosart, the Dean of the School of Theology and the host of Theology Sabbath School. Today we're continuing in our lesson, Making Friends for God, the Joy of Sharing in His Mission. And our particular lesson today on week 10 is entitled, An Exciting Way to Get Involved. And this lesson is a little unusual from the ones we've been studying the last 9 weeks, that it focuses more on the practice, the actual way to get involved in our community. And so to help us in this topic, I've invited my friend and colleague, Dr. Paul Dibdahl, who has a background in missiology, that's his expertise, to help us on this question of how the early church grew so phenomenally in those first few centuries. So Dr. Dibdahl, welcome again to Theology Sabbath School. And how are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. It's certainly been, as we've said over and over again, week by week, the world we're living in is interesting now. And so that means this summer has been different and interesting and even a little crazy. But we're gearing up for school now. Not sure exactly what that will mean for all of us. But I'm doing okay. Family as well, so I'm thankful for that.
Yeah, it is an exciting time with the school year starting. I suppose that actually brings up the question about our Sabbath school class. With some schools restarting, what does that mean for our Theology Sabbath School class when we've actually met in person here on the Walla Walla campus? We don't know yet for sure. We're looking about the possibility of restarting our class, and we'll be considering that over this next week to come. But for right now, of course, we'll continue on certainly with our online session of our class. So if you live here in the area and you're interested in our face-to-face class, stay tuned for an announcement about that. Well, let's get to our lesson actually today, and perhaps you can give us an overview, someone who's not had the opportunity to read the lesson. Can you give us kind of a sense of what this lesson is about this week?
Yeah, the lesson in its most basic form is a acknowledgement, a recognition, an explanation of the fact that God created us for social relationships. And the lesson then focuses specifically on small groups. So you asked that lead-in question about, how did the church or what was the way in which the church grew? And that's a long answer. I think there are a lot of things that factored into that. But the lesson wanted to emphasize the fact that the church organized into small groups, and that this was a key element that contributed to the explosive growth of the church in the first century. So that's the summary in its most basic form, is that God created us for social relationships. We need that. That's the way God made us.
Yeah, certainly I think that that premise is true, that God made us for relationships. And that's what makes this COVID-19 experience so difficult right now, because we're just relationship deprived. I mean, certainly we're here together, we're talking, but that's different than sitting down, having a meal together, and to touch and to enjoy life together. And that's been, I think, trying for all of us. The lesson makes this claim that the ultimate goal of small groups is soul winning. Just curious if you could share your thoughts. Because this is your background, you talk about reaching people, but what's your thoughts in reaction to that statement?
Yeah. So that quote from the lesson, the ultimate goal of small groups is soul winning. Like, there's a sense in which I would agree with that, but I think that quote is open to misunderstanding, what I would see as misunderstanding. If we think that the ultimate reason why we get together in fellowship with other people always has to have like an overt and narrow kind of evangelistic focus in the way that we sometimes understand evangelism, then I would disagree. So I don't think that getting together with others in a small group setting, for conversation, for Bible study, even for prayer. I think that something valuable happens in that nurturing kind of environment, and that small group is not a failure somehow or hasn't lived up to its purpose if at the end of the meeting we don't go out and hand out gospel tracts to people on the street, or that as a result of that, at the end of a month we don't have 3 baptisms, and if we don't, then the small group was a failure. In the larger sense, gathering together in small groups, I think, does nurture us, does build us up. It can provide accountability and instruction and all those kinds of things, which then, of course, should translate into a life that is well lived, a life that is attractive to other people, and a life that God is able to use to bring people to Him. But I'm a little uncomfortable with the phrase, if we understand it, like whatever we do in this small group, it's a failure unless, you know, someone is preaching on the street corner by the end of it. I think small groups can have a variety of different purposes and value, and that's probably a good thing.
I think that certainly we don't need to always be politically correct. And this word, soul winning, is one of those words that I just think is inadequate. So it's not just I want to be politically correct by not using the word soul winning, but I think that that term itself is problematic because it just gives this idea that, as you said, that that's all that religion is about. And I think really what we're talking about is the ultimate goal of what God desires for us, and that is whole relationships that are vibrant, that are real, that bring us happiness and joy and peace and community, fellowship with others, but also fellowship with God. And so to me, it's that whole package. And I guess I've seen sometimes this idea of soul winning being one where a pastor or evangelist, it's like they're sorting through fish, right? Looking for the good fish, a bunch of bad fish, or just throwing ones out one at a time and only looking for the good ones. When the reality is that people are not always at the same space in time. And so if we really care about people, I think there's a bigger process involved in that. I don't know if you'd agree with that. I think you would, but I don't know if you have any comment or reaction to that. Or
I would. No, I would absolutely agree with that. Yeah, well said.
the lesson makes another comment here. Let me just read it from my notes. It says, one of the contributing factors for the rapid growth of the New Testament church was their small group organizational structure. Small groups made a difference. So again, I'm going to ask for your reaction. Your thoughts on that? Agree? Disagree?
Yeah. So I feel like I'm kind of being picky with the lesson because 2 statements that in a certain sense I would agree with. We just talked about one and now the second one. But the thing that strikes me about this last quote you read, Carl, and I don't have it exactly in my mind, but it seems to be making a distinction between, like, the church used this method of small groups in order to grow. And in my understanding, it might be more accurate to say that really the New Testament church the church itself was like a small group. So it wasn't like we have the church and then we're like thinking about strategies and we'll say, how about let's organize into small groups that meet in homes? It's like, that's what the New Testament church was. They were small groups that met in people's homes or sometimes outside by the river. We read about that in Acts. So it creates like this distinction, um, talking about small groups sort of as a methodology. And I think that's what the church was. It consisted of groups of people that came together, very much like family units. They used familial terms to talk to one another, brother and sister. They greeted one another as family with the holy kiss. So the New Testament church was small groups, basically.
Now, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about, why do you think that, why is that the case, right? What is it that contributed or helped or enabled, or what made the church like that? Are there contributing factors that meant that that is what the church was? Um, just any reactions? I have a few ideas, but I'm just curious if you have any reactions to that.
Yeah, so I'd be interested in your ideas too, but I think part of it, I mean, maybe the most obvious thing is just that that's the way God made us. I mean, God made us to be in community with people. So even if you have people that are not believers, they still gather together in groups around causes or around issues or just for friendship. So that's one reason why the New Testament church was that way. That's the way God made us. But I also think that in a culture, in a society that may not be friendly to the way of life that you feel called to by God, or that doesn't support your beliefs, where you're kind of excluded maybe, not maybe, I mean in many cases you were excluded, that then in those difficult situations I think we are even more aware of our need to draw together with people that share the same share the same sort of relationship with God, who are walking the same path, for just for encouragement and nurture in a kind of a hostile world.
Yeah, I would agree with those also, and I think you might also add in the fact that there were really no church structures per se. So church buildings don't show up until 100, 200 years later. So, and there's not like a large hotel downtown Jerusalem that has a room that they could cater for 1,000 people. Not that there were 1,000 people early on like that in the church, but still there wasn't that kind of physical location. So it was the homes of people. And that meant that there'd be some homes that might be a home of a somewhat wealthy person, and that person's home could hold perhaps maybe max about 40 people. So a mega church in the first century, second century is going to be 40, maybe if you're pushing them in like sardines, maybe 60, but the average church is much smaller. So there is opportunity. I mean, there's not a lot of opportunity for everyone to come together in that larger setting. And that kind of forced, I think, the church to exist in these small family groups.
Yeah, I had a professor at the seminary. He was actually teaching on Paul, epistles of Paul, and I asked him. We were talking in class about the church. I think it was a church in Corinth, if I remember correctly. And I asked, or someone asked, well, like, how large of a church are we talking about? And he said, well, we don't know for sure. And then he gave a number which sticks in my mind. It was considerably less even, Carl, than what you suggested. He said, I don't know, maybe it was 20 people, something like that. And I just remember in my mind, when I think of the church in Corinth, um, I was not thinking of a group of 20 or even 30 people. I was thinking of a considerably larger group. So
That's been one of the interesting things when you go, for example, to the city of Pompeii outside of Italy, which because of the volcanic ash that covered the city was preserved for 2 millennia. Now you can go there and you can visit and you can walk down all these streets and you see all these homes. And what some theologians have done, they've actually taken this model of the early church and then talked about, a church that would use, this facility for a meeting, or a house of a wealthy person. And so there's a variety of different sizes, and you do begin to recognize that, wow, I mean, they're not big. Oftentimes as pastors, we think of, I'd like to have a big church so we can, have ministries and activities and, I can preach to, 200, 300 people. But I mean, that's just not even on the horizon for the church in the first century. Yet, surprisingly, with all these little small family communities, the church really did grow, I mean, rapidly from, 11 people to, 60,000 by the end of the first century and many, many more just a couple hundred years later. So I wonder then if that means, because sometimes we think about the Adventist church, and certainly we're an anomaly here in Walla Walla and other churches in large cities that have a congregation of 500 plus people. I mean, I think most Adventist churches are probably around the 40 to 60 mark, somewhere, at least less than 100 people. And I guess that would mean that's really not a disadvantage for growth, that there really is an opportunity to grow in those situations. Um, and so maybe we should recognize those possibilities rather than seeing that as a limitation. I'm curious, because you do teach, church growth and all that. So, and this is just came to my mind. I mean, what would you recommend to a church that is a small church that doesn't have the youth room and the junior class, and they maybe have one Sabbath school class or two? I mean, how do you start? How did the early church grow in that setting? Can you give us any thoughts or ideas on that?
Yeah, and the challenge will be like to know how far to go on this. Um, incredibly patient, incredibly patient. So their primary means of evangelism, and this has kind of been new for me just in the last 5 years or so. I had the idea that the early church was all about like public preaching, proclamation, and the record of history would suggest that there really wasn't much of that at all, but rather it was smaller groups of people who loved each other and then cared for the people that were around them. So this is incredibly powerful as a witness. It's not just about distributing the tracts, about public presentations, and after 3 weeks calling people to make a decision. The early church gathered together in like family units, loved each other, and people were attracted to that and wanted to find out about it. And actually, and Carl, you'd be able to talk about this as well, but that the early church was actually quite careful with who they baptized. They wanted to make sure that people who were coming to Christ were doing so at a really deep, deep level. And what that meant then is that the witness of the church, I'm trying to like be diplomatic here when I say it, but like if you're careful, um, if you're careful, and I'm still sort of struggling here with how to say it, but um, when the group as a whole really is fully committed to following Jesus, that's a light that shines really bright in the community, and it attracts people. So I think sometimes we are so desperate to kind of add to our numbers, so to speak, um, that maybe there's not always the depth of commitment. And it's not that we expect people to be perfect. It's not that people, know everything before they can be part of the fellowship. You can be part of the fellowship in process, but it seems to me there was a kind of clarity in the early church uh, about where people were expected to be. And that was people that were known in their communities as being loving and kind to the poor, tending to others, whether or not they were of the same faith commitment, same religious persuasion. And again, I'm sort of feel like I'm just circling back around to the point that makes a difference. So a small church today, I don't think we should see that as a great limitation, but I think that small church really should see itself as a family unit and try to relate to one another as family. And that would mean that you don't just gather together once a week to sit in pews to listen to a kind of formal service, but it would involve getting together more frequently and sharing food and laughing together and eating together, that sort of family atmosphere. That's attractive to people. I hope that I felt like I used tons of words, Carl. Turn that into something beautiful if you want to summarize it for me.
I don't know about that, but I think it makes me wonder if we could make the application and say maybe there's a silver lining in COVID-19, and that is it's kind of cut us off from this entertainment, consumer-oriented church experience. and can point us in the direction of the importance of meeting in small groups, for fellowship, for encouragement, for spiritual growth. I remember this last Sabbath I watched a part of Randy Roberts' sermon, and he talked about something related to this. He talked about in COVID-19, we've heard of people who watch as many as up to 5 church services on Sabbath. They're not doing anything else, so they turn into Dwight Nelson, they turn into Loma Linda, they turn into Walla Walla, wherever else they may go, and they're just consumers, right? Just consuming. And that's really not the kind of spiritual life that God has called us to. Certainly we should grow, and we need good growth, good food to grow by, but we need to be active. We need to be involved in reaching out. Otherwise, the church, I think, then truly will shrivel up. Our time is going very quickly. I wonder if we could just mention, if you have any ideas, what are some of the prominent small groups? We've talked about the concept, but to actually go to the New Testament, where do you see small groups in the New Testament in a more specific sense than just saying, well, that's just the church?
Yeah, the prominent small group to me that jumps out in the New Testament is Jesus and the 12 disciples. And I did a little bit of checking on that, and it's interesting. The listing of the 12 disciples shows up 4 different times: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then in Acts, where the 12 disciples are listed. But they're not listed in the same order. But if you compare those listings, you'll notice a pattern. It seems as though the 12 were in a way subdivided into groups of 4, 3 groups of 4, because each time the 12 disciples are listed, the first name, the 5th name, and then what would it be after 4, like each of those groups of 4 begin with the same name each time. And even apparently in a couple of those lists, linguistically, there's kind of a break. So you have the group that was especially close to Jesus, Peter, James, John, but actually it's Peter and Andrew. So the 2 brothers, the 2 brothers, the 2 groups of 2 brothers as kind of the first unit. And then the next unit, you hear about them, but not quite as often. And then the last group, a couple of those disciples, you see their names in the listing, but they're nowhere else mentioned in the gospel record. And then Judas is always last. So this actually plays out in. I think there's kind of a practical application here, in that, and maybe people are uncomfortable with this, but I think that the group of 12 operated as kind of a small group for sure, but that even within that small group, there were people that were closer to Jesus. And that doesn't mean that the others were bad people, but Jesus as a human being had closer relationships with some people than others. And I believe he went to people for encouragement and support and companionship. And there were some people that he would have just connected better with than others. And I think looking at the 12 disciples kind of helps us to see that lesson. We could also think about in the Gospel of John, Jesus' relationship with Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And John goes to great pains to point out to us that these were people that Jesus loved. I mean, there was a close relationship that he had with these 3. So those are a couple of kind of small groups that we might look at. And we don't have time, but maybe studying the disciples a little bit more, there might be some insights and applications for us.
Yeah, I think that is probably the ultimate small group in that sense. I can think of others perhaps. We have the church that's meeting at the house of Mary. I think in Acts chapter 12, when Peter is released from jail, he goes there. So you do see these people, they actually gather together. In fact, you get that phrase early on in the book of Acts that they gather together for the breaking of the bread, which some people say points to like a Lord's Supper, but maybe just in fact they're eating together and also sharing in the word. And so you just see that fellowship that expands as they want to bring people into fellowship with Jesus, which is actually a phrase that John uses in 1 John. He invites people to join that fellowship that they have with Jesus. We talked a little bit about small groups, or a lot about small groups, but maybe just a final word on what a small group accomplishes. We really kind of maybe already indicated this, but just another chance to summarize what a small group actually accomplishes.
Yeah. So the lesson lists some of these things, but a small group provides accountability. It provides support and encouragement. That's a buffer against stress. Um, it's a place of instruction. I think if we're just left to ourselves, like intellectually, we have pet ideas, perspectives, viewpoints, and again, left to ourselves, we can kind of end up off balance, a little off kilter, a little obsessed even with certain things. And when you have to kind of run those ideas by other people, other people will call us on that and probably bring us to better positions, sort of instructionally. Small groups, when we join together, there's a sense in which our efforts on behalf of other people can be multiplied, so you can pool resources. I think that's valuable. It's a place of worship, a place of prayer, and we've touched on it a little bit. I didn't think the lesson emphasized this enough, but throughout the New Testament, small groups are the settings in which you shared food, and I think that that's something that is sometimes lacking in our gatherings. Although we do all right with that in some cases too. So these are some of the benefits or the practices, the habits, some of the things that a small group would accomplish.
Our time is about up, but maybe we could just wrap up with a final question I have for you. You mentioned to me that you had just read a book called Together by, I forget the author's first name, but was it Murphy or Murray?
Murthy, Vivek Murthy, a book called entitled Together.
Yeah, could you tell us a little bit more about that? The title lends itself, I think, to this conversation. Can you kind of share some of the ideas you gathered from that book?
Yeah, so I know with time limitations here, I'll try to be brief. Just a few things, and I'll try to go make several points here. First of all, research is quite clear, and I'll give some stats here, that many Americans are lonely and feel socially isolated. It's about a quarter of Americans, it's 22% actually, that say, I usually or always feel lonely and socially isolated. Above the age of 45, that percentage actually increases to about 1/3 of Americans say, I feel lonely. So many people sense this lack of social connection. They feel that nobody knows them. The second thing that the book clearly pointed out is that this creates a huge toll on us. Loneliness does. We were made for connection, like the lesson said. And when you feel lonely and socially isolated, you don't have the same resistance to viruses. You're more likely to get sick. You don't sleep as well at night. There are more micro awakenings. You don't respond as well to stress. I already talked about that. People try to cope with the loneliness often in destructive ways. So alcohol, sort of unrestrained and destructive sexual behavior, drugs. People turn to these things to try to sort of mask the pain of loneliness. So lots of people are lonely. Loneliness has takes a real toll on people. A meta study, I think that's what you call it, a scholar from Brigham Young University and others contributing actually did a large scale study of the studies that have been done on social isolation and health. 148 studies dealing with, I think it was over 300,000 participants totally in total. And the conclusion was that indeed social isolation and loneliness increases the risk of premature death by 50%. And they said it's the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Also, like we think of obesity and excessive alcohol consumption, and we're worried about smoking. Loneliness takes not just a spiritual and an emotional toll on people, but a physical toll on people in profound ways. So simply inviting someone into a loving community benefits them in such profound ways. It is healing in and of itself. And I think we oftentimes forget that. I'm going to make one, I know that the time is tight here. I'm going to make at least one more additional comment. And that is that the effect of technology. So you talked earlier, Carl, about during COVID, we're meeting together virtually, and there's value in that, absolutely. But apparently we have kind of, if you think of sort of consent, is that the right word? Of like bullseye, right? Within the center, the bullseye, those are our intimate friends. And usually for most people, that's a max of 15 people, and often more like 5 or 6. Those are the people that really, really know us. The next circle would be of friends. These are people that we see periodically, and that number can be like 150 or so. And then the larger circle, like acquaintances, people who we probably know their names, probably, but we don't see them very often at all. That larger circle. And what technology does is it tends to expand the second and the third group of friends and acquaintances. But what it does is it tends to weaken our connections with those that are most intimate, that are closest to us, or that ought to be closest to us. So there's like a trade-off that takes place here, and ultimately that trade-off isn't good, because we're trading the quality of our intimate relationships for additional acquaintances, which don't provide the same kind of benefit to us. So these were a few things, and I will end now by just noting that physical proximity is really important to build relationships with people. Sharing of food is really valuable. This is what the research tells us. Singing together is one of the greatest ways of building cohesion within groups. So these are things that we have to do together. So maybe this is why in the book of Hebrews we read, right, don't give up the habit of meeting together, and especially as you see the day approaching. I think that's wonderful counsel for us. Help us, Lord, not to just be seeking out groups that can meet our needs, but I would hope that we would each also try to create an atmosphere of welcome so that those that are lonely can find genuine Christian fellowship and friendship. That's the work of the gospel.
Thank you, Paul. That's an excellent way, I think, to summarize this lesson and to encourage us. And I would encourage our audience, if your health allows it, to get out and go back to church. The Walla Walla University Church is opening up at 9:30 this Sabbath for the first 175 people who are pre-registered. Here locally, the Village Adventist Church is open also for live services, and also other countless small churches. And if that's something that your health won't allow you to do, I'd encourage you to reach out to someone nevertheless, to expand your friendship circles during this time, because I think it's true that many of us are lonely, and certainly we can't, because of COVID, there's restrictions that are there, but certainly it encourages us not to get so comfortable being separate that we don't return to our relationships at the end. Well, again, Dr. Dibdall, thank you. You summed it up so excellently, and also to our viewers and to Alex Paxa, our program director. We look forward to the day when all these restrictions will be lifted, and we'll be able to gather together, worshiping God, and looking forward until that day. Hope it comes soon, is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Take care. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.